Hello and welcome to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, Manny Maradiaga, live today on July 1st. Very exciting month, closer to football. We're in training camp month towards the end of the month here in July, so that's always exciting. But on today's show, we're going to talk some more NFL and a lot about statements that were made, a lot of comments that were made over the weekend that I thought would be worth bringing up here on the show. Starting off with Brandon Aiyuk appearing on the latest episode of The Pivot. What did he say about his contract negotiations and some of his actions in the offseason? Then we're talking some more about the Cowboys. Malik Hooker, a teammate of Micah Parsons, made some comments on Micah Parsons' podcast, and not the biggest fan of it, where his attention is in terms of priorities, prioritizing the podcast or playing football. He had some interesting things to say about that, and we're also going to be mentioning some more offseason grades in the AFC East. Bills, Patriots, Dolphins, and Jets all being talked about and analyzed on today's show. So before I jump into the first segment, if you guys would, with any question or comment you have on today's show, please use the tip and donations link that you see on your screen, GSMCPodcast.net. By using that, I'm able to see your question or comment in my chat box. That way I can read it on air and get your guys' thoughts on anything I say or on any of the topics on today's show. It's a massive help for the network and this show as well. So please, if you guys would, use the tip and donations link, GSMC Podcast, with any of your questions or comments. But in saying that, we're going to jump right into it. I think the most eye-catching, just headline-grabbing news that I saw over the weekend was the Pivot Podcast latest episode that came out on Friday. And just a bit of a disclaimer before we get into it. It is a little bit confusing on how it all works based on the timeline. This episode was recorded before last Monday's meeting. Exactly a week ago from today, Brandon Aiyuk requested to have a meeting with the 49ers, and since then, the reports, the sources have come out and said that the negotiations and both parties are feeling a lot better about an extension over a trade. But this episode was recorded before that, but it came out after that meeting, if that makes sense, if you guys are following. So since this was recorded before, none of that meeting ever happened yet, and Brandon Aiyuk had some interesting things to say about it, discussing his side of the negotiations that I thought were super fascinating. But first, of course, I watched the whole episode, and there were some things that I picked out that I thought I would talk about on today's show. First off, before anything was said, walking in along with Jaden Daniels, that's one thing. Walking with Jaden Daniels, they're spending every second, it seems like, of the offseason together, and that's just screaming that to me that he was going to move on. But since that meeting happened and since this episode was recorded, everything seems to indicate that they are closer to an extension. But that's the first thing I picked out. If you watch the episode, he walked in with Jaden Daniels, so that's screaming right away that there has to be something there. And then after that, the first point that was brought up about Aiyuk and how everything developed since the Super Bowl was going back to that Super Bowl in how he was used in it. You know, if you remember after that, the Super Bowl loss that they had, there was some aftermath on social media with his brother, I want to say, and his girlfriend also afterwards commenting on how the 49ers didn't use Brandon Aiyuk too well. And also it was just a topic of conversation analyzing the game afterwards. If you look at the Super Bowl, Brandon Aiyuk only had 3 receptions on 6 targets for only 49 yards. And on an Instagram post from I want to say it was Brandon Aiyuk's brother, it just said on the Instagram story, "Don't forget what got you there." And from then, there were some more quotes made after that. And people initially thought that, obviously Brandon Aiyuk was feeling salty. There were some hurt feelings there. Coming off of the Super Bowl loss, nobody ever feels great. But feeling like you could have done more and you almost weren't allowed to is another thing. And I think you have a point there. But, hindsight is always 20/20. If they would have won, nobody would have said anything. But it is hard for Brandon Aiyuk only getting 3 receptions the entire game. But then once they started talking about more of the negotiations, the first thing that I thought was super interesting that Brandon Aiyuk brought up was the quote about how he's approaching these contract negotiations, in which he said, I'm taking it personal. I have a vision for what I see myself as, and the 49ers don't see me as that. Or you do, but you don't. You can't financially do it. And he went to mention on also that, the talks are going on, but for right now and how he's approaching it, he's taking it a little bit personal. And from that point, nobody really likes to talk about finances, or at least not publicly. The fact that he mentioned he's taking it personal, that's not an approach you typically take once you're talking about money and the business side of football, right? Everybody always mentions splitting the business side and splitting the personal connections that you'd have to a teammate, to the team, and those sort of things, right? But I thought it was a great point that Ryan Clark, one of the hosts of the show, brought up on how the 49ers, almost revealed to some sources, or some reports came out that the 49ers were offering Aiyuk around $26 to $27 million, and that was a lot less than what Aiyuk wanted. Aiyuk basically wanted more, and with those reports coming out, basically airing some of the feelings, some of the conversations that the 49ers have had with Aiyuk, and some people might interpret that as, like, he's asking for too much, does he deserve too much, who is he to ask for that much? It almost paints Brandon Aiyuk in a bad picture, and those were the reports that come out. Somebody would have had to tell someone that, and off of that point, off of that idea that Ryan Clark brought up, Aiyuk felt that that it was almost disrespectful in a way, that he didn't like the way that went down for him to reveal that information or air it out to everybody, and then it almost makes him look bad, like I mentioned. But in a way, he is using that social media approach. He's been very active on Instagram, saying things on his stories, the FaceTime call and things like that. He's been active a lot over the offseason, not really mentioning too clearly, but there's always that slight intention of, you obviously know what he's referring to. So he's almost using that in a way to get his side of the negotiations out there out to everybody. If the 49ers can have sources reveal this sort of information, he was using that as a counter to sort of leverage his side of the negotiations, which I thought was super interesting on how this is all developing, and why you get a better picture of how he did things, why he was doing such things on Instagram, saying things, tweeting out at the Steelers and things like that. You kind of got an understanding why he's doing that, but more on the biggest piece of social media that came out was that FaceTime call he had with Jaden Daniels. If you guys remember, in that interaction, you saw that FaceTime call he was having with Jaden Daniels, basically saying that the 49ers, inclining about the 49ers, said that they didn't want him anymore, and Ryan Clark asked him about it, why he did that, and he said, they told me that they didn't think they were on the same page, and that they didn't believe they were going to, and that was about it at that time. And he also mentioned why it was being recorded, because him and his girlfriend are documenting this whole offseason, for their own personal reasons. So, he explained a little bit more on why, or what he meant by the 49ers, assuming he meant the 49ers, obviously he did, what he meant by that they didn't want him anymore, and just the fact that they had those conversations, and his feeling and what they said to him directly, according to him, was that they weren't going to reach a point of compromise. And this is where, after that FaceTime call, I came on here and I talked about it. I thought that was pretty much it. He's talking to Jaden Daniels directly. They've been seen hanging out all the time, so I figured that was it. The 49ers and him have reached a point where it's over. They don't see a compromise coming. But then you get the next quote, and this really put a nail in the coffin for me, on what Brandon Aiyuk was saying, and really getting all the other rumors, started when he mentioned where he envisioned playing in 2024. Ryan Clark just asked him what uniform he envisioned himself wearing this upcoming season, to which he said, as you see on the screen, if I were to take a guess, probably a Niner uniform. If not a Niners uniform, probably a Washington Commanders uniform. If not a Washington Commanders uniform, probably a Steelers uniform. Not too high on it being the Steelers. They don't have enough things to trade for them, so I'm not even going to get my hopes up. But the Commanders, obviously it's the Commanders. Jaden Daniels and him have been hanging out everywhere. He made a point of emphasis to ensure that he wants to be with the 49ers, that he would love to stay there and continue what they have there. But, he seemed throughout that whole interview, if you guys go and check it out, the entire thing, he seemed pretty even-keeled about it. He seemed pretty enthusiastic about staying, but also wouldn't, make a big deal if the business side didn't line up and he had to go and play somewhere else. He has a very good connection with Jaden Daniels from their time at Arizona State University, and now that they're both in the NFL, they would love, of course, to have that reconnection and still play together at that next level. That would be awesome, but this is where now we're at a point where there's a lot of back and forth. There's a lot of things going on, and I don't even think it makes too much sense right now to predict what's going to happen next, because anything could really happen. All the signs are positive right now, but I wouldn't be surprised if at some point this week we get a report or something saying that the negotiations are done. Brandon Aiyuk maybe posts something else to social media that takes you in a whole different direction on where you thought this was going. So, I don't know. Instead of making a prediction of whether he's going to sign, because now I'm having doubts if he's going to have an extension or not. I really thought he wasn't, that it was over, but now Brandon Aiyuk seems a little bit quiet. It seems like the 49ers are onto something here with him, but I'm going to say that we are July 1st, as I said now, so they're supposed to report the training camp by, I want to say, July 26th, 25th, or something like that. So if this deal isn't done by the 20th, or just that week leading into training camp, I don't think it's getting done. I'll give it an earlier deadline, because if we wait till training camp, if it's not done by training camp, then I really don't know what's going on, and maybe they will eventually sign one. But if it's not done by the 20th, what is that? July 20th is a Saturday. If it's not done by a Saturday, about 3 weeks from now, there's no way it happens, in my opinion. I'm still leaning towards that, but at the same time now I'm having doubts from where this Pivot podcast is taking me, from where all the other reports are saying. It's a lot of money. Obviously, is he worth it? Is he not worth it? I would have thought that I would have loved to have another season to see really be confirmed, but it seems like the 49ers are more leaning towards that way. But Aiyuk, with the market being what the market is, he feels that he's done enough up to this point, and it's hard to argue with him when everybody else is getting paid around him except him. So we'll see. We'll see where this conversation goes. It's always exciting. The conversation that he had with the Pivot podcast was very interesting. So again, I recommend you guys going to check that out. But in the meantime, we're going to take a break from the show. And when we return, we're going to talk some more about things players say about their teammates, about their teams. This time more on the Dallas Cowboys. What did Malik Hooker say about Micah Parsons' podcast? What did he mention about it? Did he like it? Did he hate it? What did Micah Parsons respond after seeing his comments? All of that is coming up on today's show, so don't go anywhere. You're listening to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast.